So what on earth was I talking about at the end of the last video? I probably sounded a little bit like a madman, repeating myself 4 or 5 times about the three premises that Derrida wants us to hold in relation, but also in tension at the same time. Okay, but I'm not going to repeat those. You can go back and look at them for a second, but I will say that it's really the third one that I want to emphasize in the rest of this lecture series, namely writing in difference as the only thinkable and possible origin that we have for ever apprehending the presence of something. Whether by presence I mean apprehending the meaning of something, or apprehending something as an experience, apprehending something through my senses, apprehending something simply through my thought, what have you, that writing in difference is the only possible origin of that apprehension of a presence, although it's going to be a messy origin, as we'll come to see. So let's go back to the beginning of the paragraph. We only read one sentence. So let's go back and read that, and then I'm going to read a few more sentences in, okay, before pausing and beginning again. Okay, so this is Derrida. Quote, "The phonic element, the term, the plenitude that is called sensible would not appear as such without the difference or opposition which gives them form." Okay. Derrida continues. Such, that is, the difference or opposition that gives form to sensibility, or that which I'm apprehending, such, Derrida says, is the most evident significance of the appeal to difference, as the reduction of phonic substance. That is, such is the most evident significance of Derrida's own appeal, and partially Saussure's appeal, to difference itself, rather than coherent presence, identity, or self-definition, as the reduction, which is to say the ground or the source, of phonic substance. That is to say, the ground or source, or the barest of bones sketch of sound images. Okay. Why? Derrida continues, here the appearing and functioning of difference, as we see in Saussure's writings, when writing itself keeps infiltrating his concepts and arguments. Right? Derrida says, here the appearing and functioning of difference presupposes an originary synthesis, not preceded by any absolute simplicity. Such would be the originary trace. End quote. So I'm going to pause there. Originary synthesis. Here we might use a word like composition instead of synthesis. Though if we spend just a bit of time thinking about synthesis and where it shows up in our everyday lives, synthetic fibers, for instance, as opposed to simple or natural ones, I think we can make quick sense of Derrida's terminology. Experience, according to Derrida, is a composition of perceptions and sensations which are radically different from the world, even though they are the forms according to which we conceive of the world as world in the first place. Speech is likewise a composition of meaningful sounds into sound images, and writing is the composition of marks, arbitrarily related to sounds we make when we shape our mouths and vibrate our vocal cords in just the right way. If difference is the true reduction, or the source or barest bones unit of anything, then it amounts to saying that the true origin of anything is always already synthetic, complex, derivative, composed of differing and oppositional elements from the get-go, right? There's no getting more upstream than that, as one of Derrida's translators would put it. What we tend to think of as derivative or secondary or artificial or synthetic is the only origin of which we can conceive. No single cause, no simple origin pre-exists either the play of absence or presence of difference or deviation within the structure of the trace, which I've talked about in previous lectures, or the structural operation of difference, as the differing and deferring of fullness or presence. I'll come back to that second one, right, of difference understood as the differing and deferring of fullness or presence. So going back to Derrida's original phrase, originary synthesis, this originary synthesis is an oxymoronic idea. For the very notion of origin has historically implied a single and simple origin, what we think of as a cause, that is fully meaningful, significant, responsible for an effect, and self-present in itself. Again, think of crime dramas. I talked about this in class a little bit, in which certain pieces of evidence are often treated as full proof signs of guilt, though most of the time they aren't full proof at all, even the final confession often can't be considered full proof. Although the whole case is built upon the idea that the criminal, or the one deemed criminal or deviant, is himself the cause of the crime, right? The full origin of it. Though, as we know, right, that's often not quite the case, right? We often need motive. There's often psychological problems, or there's often just other factors that are folded into why, right? That particular person may or may not have committed that crime, and not just whether or not they did, but why they did, right? What led up to that? Okay, that Derrida will say we can never get back to some simple answer to that question, that every stopping point we take is always going to be complex, synthetic, composed, derivative, after the fact, right? It will be nothing other than, right, a set of traces. Thus, the phrase originary trace that ends the passage I just read a few minutes ago is impossible, contradictory, self-deconstructive, and unstable, and yet for Derrida, this phrase, originary trace or originary synthesis, is no less the case, and the rule of meaning, signification, appearance, experience, and representation. To put it a different way, the only origin is the impossibility of a simple origin, and the inescapability of difference, otherness, complicity, leakiness, and mutation from the get-go in the full play of traces. Let's keep reading. This is Derrida. Quote, without a retention in the minimal unit of temporal experience, meaning without some trace of the past within a present moment, or a moment that we think of as fully present, without some sort of retention of a past in that moment, without a trace retaining the other, the exterior as exterior in the same, no difference would do its work and no meaning would appear, end quote. There would be no apprehension, this is me talking, there would be me talking. I'm not quoting Derrida, this is me. There would be no apprehension or expression of meaning. We would not understand meaning as meaning if difference and the possibility of misapprehension or mutation were not already there from the start. Let's keep reading. Quote, it is not the question of a constituted difference here, but rather, before all determination of content, the pure movement which produces difference. The pure trace is difference, end quote. So let's try to unpack these sentences a little bit. Not a question of constituted difference, but something else. The pure movement which produces specific differences. Okay, what on earth does Derrida mean? Just as in the case of writing, where Derrida switches back and forth between writing in the narrow sense, right, inscribed marks, and a much more structural or ontological operation to which he gives the name archwriting, right? Derrida seems to be talking about, at the same time, specific differences, right? Love, hate, man, woman, writing, speech, speech, presence, absence, intelligible, sensible, so on. These are specific oppositions or differences he's analyzing. So he's talking about specific oppositions, but he's also talking about a much more structural, ontological, and primary operation to which he gives the name difference. Okay? So writing in the narrow sense is to arca-writing, as specific or concrete differences are to difference. Okay? On the one hand, in other words, Derrida works with specific material or conceptual oppositions. I've just given you some examples, and shows how the exterior deprivileged term continues to sneak back into any attempt to determine and secure the privileged term, right, in itself. In short, both terms, right, whenever this is attempted, are always already at work as an opposition, right, as others, right, in tension with each other. On the other hand, Derrida also refers to something much more fundamental than specific oppositions. That is, to something that possibilizes or makes possible the very opposition itself. The very fact that those terms become spaced apart and set into some kind of difference or opposition between them. Right? Derrida is after this much more fundamental thing or operation. He's after the conditions under which specific differences can emerge at all. Quote, the pure movement which produces the differences within specific instances. He's after what he calls in this passage the pure trace. Okay. We can also understand writing in the narrow sense and arca-writing, or differences and difference. We can also sort of pair up here specific traces and what he calls here the pure trace, or the originary trace, from our earlier sentence. So, meaning, identity, experience, language, materiality, spirituality, ideality, the world, science, literature, art, the human, indeed life itself. These are all derivative effects for Derrida of the operation, the movement, and the notion of what he calls difference. The possibility of difference, the possibility of articulation, the possibility of spacing and setting things in opposition, or things becoming set in opposition. Right? This is difference. But difference is also the occultation or the disguising of that difference, and the formation of an illusion of a fully present presence. Whether that be God, myself, my intention, my purpose, my DNA, my life, etc. Wherever we try to mark, right, the primary source or origin of some sort of full presence or full meaning, Derrida is going to say that difference itself, right, paradoxically, is the very origin of that sense that we can get at something fully present, even though we can't. And difference, remember, is also the impossibility of presence, right? Let's keep reading. So I'm going to read a big chunk here now, and we're going to move from 62 to 63 in this next section. Difference does not depend on any sensible plenitude. This is important. Audible or visible, phonic or graphic. Difference is, on the contrary, the condition of such a plenitude. Although it does not exist, although it is never a being present outside of all plenitude, difference's possibility is by rights anterior, meaning before, all that one calls sign, concept, or operation, motor, or sensory. This difference is therefore not more sensible than intelligible, and it permits the articulation, we're going to come back to that word, articulation, of signs among themselves within the same abstract order, a phonic or graphic text, for example, or between two orders, right? Speech and writing, for instance, or language and body gesture, for instance, right? Difference, difference, difference is what gives rise to our sense of a sign as something that's somehow fully meaningful, right? It's also the impossibility that it can be fully meaningful, but it's also the condition under which signs begin to chain up together into what Derrida will later call a text, right? A text as a web of traces. Okay. So we can surmise from this passage that I've just read, sort of heavy passage, that Derrida's neologism, meaning his made-up word, difference, refers to an operation that does not need us, that does not need our capacities to perceive, think, or feel. Difference would go on, in other words, without intelligibility, without sensibility, without language, without speech, in a post-human world. A world unimaginable and unthinkable to the philosophical and theological traditions in which Derrida is working. Though not so unimaginable to modern sciences like quantum physics, cosmology, evolutionary biology, programming, technology, and or cybernetics. And this is why Derrida brings these up earlier in the book. It also shouldn't surprise us that these fields are the very fields that have inspired a great deal of dystopian, post-apocalyptic, and speculative fiction, right? Like David Mitchell's, which we read just this past week and will be reading again later in the semester. Difference. Difference, then, is the operation, right, that does not rely on us, is the very operation of spacing things out, of things being related together, of things opposing each other, the condition under which they oppose each other, the condition in which they transform each other, the condition in which terms are composed together in a text or a web, the condition under which they are dissolved or decomposed, the conditions under which they are articulated. But we'll get, again, to this word articulation later. It is the world, existence, life, it. By it here, I mean difference. What Derrida means by difference is an operation by which, or with which, the world, existence, life, death, and or the cosmos writes itself. It writes itself, right? It writes itself. So why don't we pause here and think for just a second. I'm going to come back. Part 3 video, and say what I mean here, because this sounds a little mystical, right? That for Derrida, difference is the world, right? Life writing itself. Okay. If we keep in mind if we keep in mind that what I mean by writing here goes back to the first part of this lecture series, right? Where what we mean here is arca writing. Okay, is sort of arca writing itself. Okay, so we'll come back to this in the third part of this lecture series.